Tonight we wade into the gritty, the intoxicating, and the not-so-glorious side of a powder that promised the world. Forget the Hollywood versions. To live it, honestly, was exhausting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper, let's go in. In the thin, sharp air of the high Andes, where breath comes dear and the sun is a cruel god, a small green leaf was more than sustenance. For millennia, it was a sacrament. Before there were empires of gold, before the Spanish galleons scarred the horizon, there was Erythroxylum coca, the divine leaf. Its origins are lost in the deep time of South America, a whisper in the archaeological record dating back at least 8,000 years. Traces of its alkaloid have been found in the hair of mummies from the coast of Peru. Bodies wrapped in fine textiles and buried with a small pouch, a chuspa, containing a carefully preserved cluster of the desiccated leaves. This was not a casual habit. This was a ritual compact between humanity and the unforgiving landscape. The plant itself is unassuming. A shrub, really, with bright green oval leaves and small white flowers that give way to red berries. It prefers the humid, steep slopes of the Yungas, the eastern foothills of the Andes, a precarious vertical world where clouds cling to the mountainsides. Here, ancient cultures learned to terrace the earth, to build intricate walls of stone that climb towards the sky, creating stairways of cultivation for their sacred crop. For the Inca, the last and greatest of the Andean empires, this leaf was the nexus of their world. They called it Mama Coca, a feminine deity, a gift from the sun god Inti, to soothe the suffering of his children. But this gift was not given freely, and it was certainly not for everyone. The Inca state was a marvel of totalitarian logistics, a vast, centrally planned empire connected by a sprawling network of stone-paved roads. And coca was a state-controlled commodity. Its use was a jealously guarded privilege, reserved for the Sapa Inca himself, the royalty, the high priests, and a few other designated classes. When the priests sought to commune with the gods or divine the future, they would chew a quid of leaves, the wad tucked into their cheek, slowly releasing its power. The patterns the leaves made when cast upon a ceremonial cloth were read as omens, guiding decisions of state, of war, of life and death. When a high-ranking official travelled, he carried a ration of coca. When a labourer was conscripted for the mita, the mandatory public service that built the temples of Cuzco and the fortresses of Machu Picchu, he was given a daily measure of leaves. It was not for pleasure. It was fuel. It suppressed the pangs of hunger, it dulled the ache of exhaustion, and it held at bay the crippling effects of altitude sickness. The empire's arteries were its roads, and its lifeblood was the chasqui, the imperial runner. These men were the Inca internet, a relay system of messengers who could carry a message from Quito to Cuzco, a distance of over 1,000 miles, in under a week. They ran in punishing sprints, from one small stone outpost to the next, and their constant companion was the coca leaf. It gave them the endurance to conquer the mountain passes, to run until their lungs burned, to deliver the word of the emperor before it grew stale. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1532 saw this practice and, through the rigid lens of their own faith, saw only idolatry. The Catholic priest declared it a tool of the devil, an impediment to conversion. Early decrees from Lima sought to ban its cultivation and use entirely. But this moral certitude soon collided with a much more powerful force: economics. The Spanish had not come to the New World for souls, they had come for silver. And deep within the earth, at a hellish altitude of 13,000 feet, they found a mountain made of it. Potosi. To tear the silver from the guts of that mountain, they needed labour, an endless supply of disposable labour. They adopted and corrupted the Inca mita system, forcing tens of thousands of indigenous men into the dark, airless tunnels. The work was brutal, the conditions lethal. Men died from collapses, from mercury poisoning used in the refining process, from sheer exhaustion. And the Spanish quickly, pragmatically, realised what the Inca had known all along. The coca leaf could make men work beyond the limits of human endurance. It allowed the mine owners to feed their workers less, to push them harder, to extract more silver with a lower overhead. And so the church fell shit. The very priests who had called coca the work of Satan now owned coca plantations, The leaf, once a divine privilege, became a wage, a tool of colonial subjugation. It was the lubricant for the great machine of extraction that funneled the wealth of the Andes into the coffers of the Spanish crown, fueling the golden age of an empire half a world away. For 300 years, the leaf remained in its mountain home, a local sacrament and a local sorrow, its true power locked inside, waiting for the curious minds of a different continent to turn the key. That key was turned not in a temple, but in a laboratory. As the 19th century dawned, European science was in a fever of discovery, dissecting the natural world and cataloguing its components. Botanists and chemists were obsessed with alkaloids, the potent nitrogen-containing compounds found in plants. They had already isolated morphine from the opium poppy, quinine from the cinchona bark, and caffeine from coffee beans. The unassuming coca leaf, which had begun to arrive in Europe in dried bales, scientific curiosity, was a natural next target. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Gaedeke managed to isolate a crude yellowish substance he called erythroxyline, but the process was inefficient, the yield impure. The final breakthrough came 5 years later in 1860 in the quiet university town of Göttingen. A graduate student named Albert Niemann, working under the famed chemist Friedrich Wöhler, refined the process. Using a meticulous series of chemical washes and distillations, he extracted a pure crystalline alkaloid, white, odourless, bitter. He described in his dissertation how a few crystals placed on his tongue made it go numb, a temporary deadening. He gave this new substance a proper scientific name, derived from the plant and the standard alkaloid suffix, cocaine. The world did not immediately notice. The discovery languished in academic journals for a time, a footnote in the grand march of chemistry. Its reintroduction to the world came not through science, but through commerce, and with a glass of wine. Angelo Mariani, a shrewd Corsican entrepreneur in Paris, had an epiphany. He understood that the European public was exhausted, anxious, and enamoured with the idea of scientific tonics that could restore their vitality. In 1863, he began importing tons of high-quality Peruvian coca leaves and steeping them in fine Bordeaux wine. The alcohol acted as a solvent, extracting the cocaine from the leaves and creating a potent, palatable elixir. He called it Vin Mariani. It was a sensation. Mariani was a marketing genius, perhaps the first of his kind. He solicited testimonials from everyone who was anyone. Popes Leo XIII and Pius V endorsed it. Leo even awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal. Queen Victoria drank it. Thomas Edison credited it with helping him stay awake through long nights of invention. Ulysses S. Grant sipped it while writing his memoirs, battling throat cancer. Writers from Émile Zola to Jules Verne penned glowing tributes. Mariani's advertisements were everywhere, proclaiming his coca wine as the ultimate cure for fatigue, depression, and malaise. It was the perfect tonic for the frantic energy of the Belle Époque. The logistics were impressive. A global supply chain stretching from the high Andes to a Parisian factory, which then shipped millions of bottles of this cocaine-laced wine to a waiting world. America, always eager to improve upon a European success, soon followed. In Atlanta, Georgia, a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was wrestling with his own demons. A Confederate veteran wounded in the Civil War, he was addicted to morphine, a common affliction among former soldiers treated with the powerful painkiller. Seeking a cure for his own addiction, and inspired by Mariani's success, he created Pemberton's French wine coca. It was essentially an American version of Vin Mariani, and it was immediately popular. But in 1886, Pemberton's enterprise hit a local snag. Fulton County enacted prohibition. Alcohol was now off the table. Undeterred, Pemberton scrambled to reformulate his tonic. He replaced the wine base with a sugary syrup and carbonated water, added an extract from the caffeine-rich cola nut for an extra kick, and kept the coca leaf extract. He called his new temperance-friendly creation Coca-Cola. The elixir of life was born, sold from the soda fountain as a cure for headaches, nervousness, and exhaustion. Each glass contained a not insignificant dose of cocaine, a fact the company now understandably downplays, but which was then its central selling point. While entrepreneurs were getting the public high, the medical establishment was catching up, thanks in large part to the impassioned advocacy of a young, ambitious Viennese neurologist, Sigmund Freud. In 1884, Freud was still years away from developing psychoanalysis. He was a struggling researcher looking for a discovery that would make his name and fortune. He stumbled upon reports of cocaine's effects and began experimenting on himself. He was euphoric. In his seminal paper, Über Coca, he celebrated the substance in rapturous terms. He declared it a miracle drug, a cure for depression, a stimulant that induced a feeling of exhilaration and lasting euphoria with no ill effects. Most dangerously, he promoted it as a treatment for morphine addiction. He gave it to his patients, to his friends, to his fiancée, Martha, to make her strong and give her rosy cheeks. Freud's immense intellectual authority gave cocaine a stamp of legitimacy it had lacked. It was no longer just a component in a popular tonic. It was a serious therapeutic agent. His work inspired a colleague, the ophthalmologist Carl Koller, to investigate Niemann's original observation about the numbing effect. In a series of brilliant experiments, Koller discovered that a solution of cocaine applied to the eye rendered it completely insensitive to pain. In 1884, he demonstrated his findings, performing surgery on the eye of a fully conscious animal, and then a human, without any sign of distress. The audience of physicians was stunned. This was the birth of local anesthesia. It revolutionized surgery, particularly in delicate fields like ophthalmology and dentistry. Before cocaine, such procedures were either brutally fast or performed on patients knocked unconscious with ether or chloroform. Now, a surgeon could work carefully on a specific part of the body while the patient remained awake and pain-free. In the final 2 decades of the 19th century, cocaine was king. It was the Victorian era's wonder drug, a panacea for the modern age. The American pharmaceutical company Park Davis sold it in every conceivable form. Powder, cigarettes, hypodermic injection kits complete with a vial of cocaine hydrochloride, even a Coca-Cola-inspired soft drink of their own called Coca Cordial. You could buy cocaine-infused throat lozenges for singers and public speakers, and toothache drops for teething infants. It was celebrated in medical journals, advertised in popular magazines, and consumed by millions who believed they were simply taking a sophisticated, scientifically approved remedy for the stresses of daily life. The leaf of the Andes had been stripped of its soul, its alkaloid isolated and amplified, and its power unleashed upon a world that was utterly enchanted by its promise and completely unprepared for its price. The fall from grace was as swift as the ascent was spectacular. The whispered warnings that had been dismissed as anecdotal soon grew into a chorus of alarm. The miracle cure began to reveal its darker side. Physicians started to report on a disturbing new pattern among their patients and all too often among themselves. Users who had started taking cocaine for melancholy or fatigue found they could not stop. The euphoria gave way to paranoia, restlessness, and terrifying hallucinations. A common one was the sensation of insects crawling under the skin, a phenomenon that became known as cocaine bugs, or formication. The promise of enhanced performance curdled into compulsive repetitive behaviours and a total collapse of judgment. The wonder drug was creating a new and particularly vicious form of addiction. No case was more damning than one from Sigmund Freud's own circle. He had enthusiastically treated his good friend Dr. Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow for morphine addiction by prescribing large doses of cocaine. The result was a catastrophe. Fleischl-Marxow traded one addiction for another, a far more destructive one. He descended into a full-blown cocaine psychosis, ravaged by paranoid delusions and the constant torment of white snakes crawling over his skin. He died a few years later, a shattered man. The experience horrified Freud. He ceased his open advocacy for cocaine and rarely spoke of it again, but the damage was done. The genie he had helped release from the bottle was now ravaging the lives of people across Europe and America. The public narrative began to shift, driven by sensationalist press eager for a new boogeyman. Where advertisements had once praised cocaine's virtues, newspaper headlines now screamed about its vices. Stories of high society scandals, of promising careers ruined, of fortunes squandered on the white powder became commonplace. But the moral panic took on its most sinister and enduring form in the United States, where it became inextricably and deliberately entangled with the country's deepest anxieties about race. In the American South, lurid and utterly unsubstantiated stories began to circulate, claiming that cocaine use was rampant among African American labourers. These tales were crafted to stoke white fear. Newspapers printed shocking accounts of cocaine-crazed Negroes committing heinous crimes with superhuman strength and cunning. A prominent article in the New York Times in 1914, written by a Dr. Edward H. Williams, claimed that cocaine made black men better marksmen and rendered them temporarily immune to pistol bullets. Southern police forces even began switching to higher caliber revolvers, citing the need for more stopping power against these supposed drug-fueled maniacs. This was a calculated racial mythology. It transformed the cocaine user from a pitiable, often white, middle-class victim of medical fad into a dangerous, black criminal predator. The drug was no longer just a personal vice, it was a threat to the social order, a catalyst for racial conflict that demanded a swift and powerful state response. The wheels of federal regulation, which had been turning slowly, began to accelerate. An early crucial step was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, spurred by muckraking journalists exposing the fraudulent and often dangerous contents of patent medicines. The law did not ban any substances. It simply mandated accurate labelling. For the first time, companies had to list ingredients like alcohol, morphine and cocaine on their product packaging. The effect was immediate. Consumers were shocked to learn that the soothing syrups they gave their children were laced with opiates, and that their favourite pick-me-up tonics were loaded with cocaine. Faced with public outcry and the threat of lost sales, many manufacturers quietly reformulated their products. It was around 1903, even before the law was passed, that the Coca-Cola Company, sensitive to the changing winds, removed the active cocaine alkaloid from its flagship drink, switching to decocainized coca leaf extract to maintain the name and flavour profile. But labelling was not enough for the growing chorus of reformers, temperance advocates and race baiters demanding total prohibition. The diplomatic stage provided the final push. The United States, seeking to expand its influence in Asia, wanted to help China curb its devastating opium epidemic. To have the moral authority to lead international anti-drug conventions, America first had to get its own house in order. The result was the culmination of 2 decades of rising panic. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. On its face, the Harrison Act was not a prohibition law. It was a tax law framed as a piece of revenue legislation to survive constitutional challenges. It required any person who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed cocaine and opiates to register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and use specific order forms. It seemed like a simple matter of regulation. But its enforcement transformed American society. The Treasury Department agents tasked with enforcing the act interpreted its provisions in the most stringent way possible. They ruled that prescribing narcotics to an addict to maintain their habit was not a legitimate medical practice. Doctors who continued to do so were harassed, arrested, and prosecuted. Many were jailed. The medical profession, intimidated, quickly backed away from treating addiction altogether. The consequences were profound and immediate. The supply of legal cocaine, once available over the counter at any pharmacy, vanished. The user, who a decade earlier had been seen as a patient or a consumer, was now legally redefined as a criminal. The act did not stop cocaine use, it merely drove it underground. It closed the door of the pharmacy and the soda fountain, and in doing so, opened a new, darker door. The one that led to the back alley, the illicit dealer, and the vast, violent, and immensely profitable black market. The era of cocaine as a medical miracle was over. Its reign as a public enemy, and as the fuel for a century of crime and conflict, was just beginning. With the stroke of a pen and the righteous certainty of lawmakers, the crystalline powder was banished. Driven from the sunlit counters of pharmacies and the cheerful fizz of soda fountains, it did not vanish. Of course not. It simply went home with a different sort of person. Prohibition, you see, rarely eradicates a desire. It merely raises the price and curates the guest list. And so, cocaine, stripped of its medical legitimacy, underwent a remarkable transformation. It became a secret, and secrets, especially expensive ones, are the most coveted of all status symbols. The powder became the clandestine handshake of the new elite, a glittering communion for those who lived ahead of the curve, or simply above the law. In the Roaring Twenties, an age drunk on bathtub gin and giddy with rebellion, cocaine was the perfect accessory. It was the ghost in the machine of the Jazz Age. In the hazy, blue smoke-filled speakeasies of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, where the frantic energy of the Charleston rattled the floorboards, a small, discreet vial was a sign that you were truly part of the inner circle. It was fast, it was modern, it was outrageously illegal. It was everything the era celebrated. For the flapper, with her bobbed hair and newfound freedoms, it was a way to dance until dawn. For the Wall Street speculator, flush with cash from a market that only ever went up, it was a way to feel as invincible as his portfolio. The substance was whispered about, offered in hushed tones in the powder rooms of grand hotels or the back seats of rumbling Duesenbergs. It was a fuel for the party that was never meant to end, a chemical guarantee that the night and the decade would burn brighter and faster than any that had come before. This secret society of indulgence had its Westernton chapter, of course, in a sun-drenched town that was busy manufacturing the nation's dreams, Hollywood. In the flickering silent world of early cinema, the pressures were immense. Fortunes were made overnight. An unknown girl from Ohio could become a goddess in a matter of months, her face projected 30 feet high for the adoration of millions. The studios demanded inhuman hours, relentless energy, and a constant, dazzling performance both on and off the screen. In this crucible of fame, the little white powder found a very welcome home. They called it Girl or Nose Candy, a whimsical nickname for a demanding chemical mistress. It was the pick-me-up before a long night of shooting under hot Klieg lights, the social lubricant at a debauched weekend party in a Laurel Canyon mansion, the silent partner in many a star's meteoric rise and tragic fall. The death of heartthrob Wallace Reed in 23, officially from morphine addiction acquired after an onset injury, ripped the curtain back just enough for the public to glimpse the rot beneath the glamour. It was a scandal that terrified the studio heads, not because of the human cost, but because of the threat to the box office. The industry scrambled to police itself with the Hays Code, a new set of moral guidelines. But all it really did was force the secrets deeper underground, making them even more tantalizing for those who could afford them. The powder wasn't just for the hedonists, it also found a place among the thinkers, the writers and the artists. In the bohemian enclaves of Greenwich Village and the smoky cafes of post-war Paris, cocaine was presented not as a party favour, but as a key to unlock perception, to shatter the mundane, to fuel the engine of creativity through the lonely early hours of the morning. For the surrealist painter, it might offer a fleeting, jagged vision. For the novelist wrestling with the great American novel, it was a way to keep the words flowing, to push past the wall of exhaustion and doubt. It was seen as a tool, a cerebral stimulant that could sharpen the mind and peel back the layers of reality. This, of course, was a beautiful and dangerous illusion. The creativity it seemed to inspire was often just frantic, scattered energy. The profound insights merely the circular, self-referential ramblings of a brain chemistry gone haywire. But the myth was powerful. It wrapped the drug in a cloak of intellectual seriousness, making it a sacrament for the avant-garde. And who supplied this clandestine world? Who connected the Hollywood starlet with the Parisian poet? The criminal underworld, naturally. The same shrewd, unsentimental businessmen who ran the bootlegging empires saw a perfect opportunity for product diversification. Figures like Arnold Rothstein, the New York kingpin who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series, understood the simple economics of vice. Cocaine was a luxury good. It was low volume, high margin and portable. It didn't require fleets of trucks or cavernous warehouses like illegal liquor. A few well-placed smugglers, a network of discreet dealers, and you could service the wealthiest, most influential corners of society. The supply lines were still rudimentary, often relying on legitimate pharmaceutical supplies diverted from Europe or small, opportunistic shipments from South America. But the foundation was being laid. The demand was established. Cocaine had found its new identity. A forbidden luxury. A powder that separated the daring, the decadent, and the damned from the ordinary world. It was a promise of energy, of brilliance, of belonging. A very expensive promise, paid for in cash at first and then, inevitably, in other currencies. While the bright young things of the North were discovering the illicit thrill of the powder, its story was beginning in earnest far to the south, under the high, thin sun of the Andes. For centuries, the indigenous people of Peru and Bolivia had a relationship with the coca leaf that was anything but decadent. It was a matter of survival. They chewed the leaves, often mixed with a bit of ash or lime to help release the alkaloids, for energy to work at punishing altitudes, to stave off hunger, and for ritual and medicinal purposes. The coca leaf was a gift from the gods, a sacred plant woven into the very fabric of their culture. It was a mild stimulant, a part of the landscape as common and as essential as the potato. The transformation of this sacred leaf into a global commodity is a story of chemistry, ambition, and geography. It begins not with cartels, but with quiet, entrepreneurial chemists and smugglers who saw an opportunity to connect the ancient agricultural bounty of the Andes with the growing nervous appetite of the world. In the middle of the 20th century, the first true pioneers of the international cocaine trade began to emerge. They were not at first the flamboyant narcos of later legend. They were often sharp, calculating businessmen operating in the shadows. For a time, the hub of this nascent industry was not Colombia, but the long coastal nation of Chile. In cities like Valparaiso and Santiago, smugglers who had cut their teeth in other rackets saw the potential. One of the key figures was a Chilean woman known as the Godmother, a restaurateur who used her business as a front to build one of the first major trafficking networks in the 1960s. Her organisation was sophisticated for its time. They didn't just move the product, they controlled the production. The process they developed became the blueprint for the entire industry. It was a grim alchemy, turning a green leaf into a white powder. First, the coca leaves harvested by poor farmers in the remote valleys of Peru and Bolivia were taken to crude, hidden pits in the jungle. There, they were soaked in gasoline or kerosene and mashed into a pulp, often by men stomping on them with their bare feet. This slurry was then mixed with acid and other chemicals to extract the raw cocaine alkaloids, creating a gritty, off-white substance known as pasta base, or coca paste. This paste was the crucial intermediate product. It was far more compact and potent than the raw leaves, making it easier to smuggle across borders. The coca paste would be flown in small rickety planes from the jungles of Bolivia and Peru into the deserts of northern Chile. There, in clandestine laboratories, often little more than shacks or hidden basements, the final delicate stage of refinement would take place. Chemists, some of whom were professionally trained, would use a volatile cocktail of chemicals like ether and acetone to purify the coca paste, washing away the impurities until only the pure glittering crystals of cocaine hydrochloride remained. It was a dangerous, foul-smelling process. One mistake, one stray spark, and the entire lab could go up in a ball of fire, but the profits were astronomical. A kilo of coca paste bought for a few $100s in the Bolivian jungle could be transformed into a kilogram of pure cocaine worth thousands of dollars in Santiago and tens of thousands in the United States or Europe. The early Chilean traffickers established the routes, flying the finished product to staging points in Central America and the Caribbean, or using mules, human couriers, to carry small amounts on commercial flights. They were building the very first iteration of a multinational supply chain based on a single powerful product. Then history intervened. In 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile. In the brutal crackdown that followed, Pinochet's new regime had little tolerance for independent criminal enterprises. Many of the established traffickers were arrested, executed, or forced to flee. The Chilean connection was severed. But the demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, it was growing exponentially. A vacuum had been created, and nature, especially the nature of black markets, abhors a vacuum. The business of refining coca paste and exporting the finished product needed a new home, and it found one just up the coast, in a country with a long history of smuggling, a weak central government, and a class of ambitious, utterly ruthless young men who were hungry for wealth and power. That country was Colombia. The entire centre of gravity of the cocaine trade shifted north, and in doing so it set the stage for an explosion of violence and wealth that the world had never seen. The quiet, business-like smuggling of the Chilean era was about to be replaced by something far more monstrous. The machine was about to be built. The men who built this machine were not from the traditional Colombian elite. They were from the rough, striving middle classes of cities like Medellin. They were men who had grown up with a chip on their shoulder, watching the old money families run the country from their exclusive clubs and haciendas. They saw cocaine not as a social vice, but as a historic opportunity, a vehicle for their own violent form of upward mobility. And at the centre of this new class of narco-entrepreneurs was one man whose name would become synonymous with the drug itself, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Escobar was not a genius chemist or a master logistician, not at first. His genius lay in his vision and his terrifying lack of restraint. He began his career in the grimy underworld of Medellin, stealing cars, smuggling cigarettes, and running kidnapping for ransom schemes. He was pragmatic, brutal, and possessed an innate understanding of the two levers that move the world: fear and desire. When the cocaine trade began to migrate from Chile, Escobar didn't just see a chance to participate, he saw a chance to dominate. He understood that the real money wasn't in just moving a few kilos. It was in controlling the entire chain of production, from the leaf to the street. It was in industrializing the process. He and his associates formed what became known as the Medellin Cartel. It was less a rigid hierarchical organization and more a loose, powerful consortium of traffickers who cooperated to maximize profits and protect their business. There were the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Jr., who came from a family of horse breeders and brought a touch of old-world business sense to the enterprise. There was Carlos Leyder, a brilliant, eccentric, and volatile German Colombian who idolized both John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. Leyder's great contribution was logistical. He bought a small island in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay and transformed it into the ultimate smuggling depot. He built a runway, a radar system, and refrigerated warehouses. From this private fiefdom, just a short flight from the Florida coast, the cartel could fly plane load after plane load of cocaine directly into the insatiable American market. What Escobar and his partners did was apply the principles of industrial capitalism to a criminal enterprise. They vertically integrated. They financed coca cultivation in Peru and Bolivia, ensuring a steady supply of raw material. They built vast, sprawling laboratory complexes deep in the Colombian jungle known as superlabs. These weren't sheds, they were small cities. They had airplane hangars, dormitories for the hundreds of workers, kitchens, power generators, and sophisticated chemical processing equipment. At complexes like Tranquilandia, they could produce 10 to 20 tons of pure cocaine every single week. Tons. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. They were no longer smugglers, they were manufacturers, producing a product for a global market on an assembly line of breathtaking efficiency. The logistics of moving the product were equally audacious. Fleets of small aircraft, each carrying several hundred kilograms, made the journey from Colombia to Norman's Cay or dropped their waterproofed cargo into the ocean to be picked up by speedboats. They even invested in submarines, crude diesel-powered vessels that could carry a ton or two of cocaine while submerged, making them nearly invisible to law enforcement. And then there was the money. The profits were so vast they became a logistical problem in their own right. Billions of dollars in cash, mostly small bills from street sales in the United States, had to be brought back to Colombia. It was stuffed into suitcases, packed into the landing gear of private jets, hidden inside television sets and refrigerators. The cartel was spending thousands of dollars a month just on rubber bands to bundle the stacks of cash. Pablo Escobar at his peak was estimated to be one of the richest men in the world, with a personal fortune in the tens of billions. He was wealthier than many nations. With this incredible wealth came incredible power, and Escobar intended to use it to bend the entire nation of Colombia to his will. His business strategy was simple, and he articulated it with chilling clarity. Plata o plomo. Silver or lead. For any policeman, judge, politician, or journalist who stood in his way, there was a choice. You could accept a bribe, the silver, and look the other way, becoming rich in the process. Or you could refuse, and you and your family would receive the lead, a bullet. It was a campaign of corruption and terror waged on an industrial scale. The cartel systematically infiltrated every level of the Colombian state. They had judges on their payroll who would dismiss any charges against them. They had police commanders who would provide security for their shipments. They had politicians who would block any legislation that threatened their interests, most notably the extradition treaty with the United States, which the traffickers feared more than a Colombian prison. Escobar himself, in a move of breathtaking arrogance, had himself elected as an alternate to the Colombian Congress in 1982, seeking the legitimacy and legal immunity that came with the office. But when charisma and cash were not enough, the cartel unleashed the lead, and they did so with a ferocity that plunged Colombia into a state of civil war. The Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who dared to denounce Escobar and strip him of his congressional immunity, was gunned down in his car in Bogotá in 1984. Luis Carlos Galán, a charismatic presidential candidate who made the fight against the cartels the centerpiece of his campaign and was the clear frontrunner to win, was assassinated at a public rally in 1989. They placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203 in an attempt to kill another presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who was not on board, murdering all 107 people on the plane. They detonated a massive truck bomb outside the headquarters of the DAS, Colombia's security agency, killing 70 people and wounding hundreds. This was not crime. This was narco-terrorism. These were not the actions of a mere gang. They were the actions of a parallel state, a corporate entity with its own army and its own foreign policy, waging a war against a sovereign nation. The Medellin cartel, under the leadership of Pablo Escobar, had taken the simple coca leaf and transformed it into a weapon of mass destabilization. They had built a machine that produced not just a drug, but an empire of corruption, addiction, and fear, funded by an endless river of white powder flowing north. An empire that held an entire country hostage, forcing its people to choose every single day between silver and lead. While the world's cameras and headlines were transfixed by the volcanic, almost theatrical violence of Medellin, a very different kind of organisation was quietly consolidating its power a few hundred kilometres to the south, in the sun-drenched city of Cali. If Pablo Escobar was a narco-warlord, a figure of chaotic public brutality, his rivals in Cali were something far more modern, and in many ways, far more insidious. They were the board of directors of a multinational corporation whose primary product happened to be cocaine. They called themselves Los Caballeros de Cali, the gentlemen of Cali, and they cultivated this image with meticulous care. Theirs was not the path of the car bomb and the public assassination. Theirs was the path of the quiet bribe, the leveraged politician, the compromised judge. They understood a fundamental truth that Escobar in his egomania often forgot. True power is not the ability to blow up a building, but the ability to ensure no one is ever prosecuted for it. The cartel was a syndicate, a partnership of four key figurees, each with a distinct role. At the top were the brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela. Gilberto, the elder, was known as El Ajedrecista, the chess player. He was the strategist, the visionary, the public face of their legitimate businesses. He was a man who moved comfortably in the highest circles of Colombian society, a respected banker and philanthropist. His brother Miguel was the nuts and bolts of the operation, the CEO who managed the day-to-day logistics of a global trafficking empire. He was more private, more ruthless, the iron hand inside Gilberto's velvet glove. Together they had built a business empire that began, innocently enough, with a chain of pharmacies. They expanded into banking, real estate, and even owned the city's beloved football team, America de Cali. These were not just fronts. They were highly profitable, legitimate enterprises that gave the brothers immense social and political capital, and just as importantly, provided the perfect infrastructure for laundering the billions of dollars that would soon come pouring in. The other two partners were specialists. Helmer Herrera, known as Pacho, was the logistics and distribution genius. From his base in Cali, he oversaw the complex transportation networks that moved cocaine out of Colombia, and crucially managed the vast and intricate distribution cells within the United States, particularly in New York City. The fourth man was Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, or Chepe. He was the cartel's ambassador, its pioneer. It was Santa Cruz who, in the late 1970s and early 80s, had personally gone to New York to build the foundations of their American operation. He wasn't a gangster kicking down doors. He was a businessman opening accounts, renting warehouses, and forging alliances. He understood the American market better than anyone. He knew its rhythms, its appetites, its vulnerabilities. The Cali model was built on information and infiltration. They invested more in technology and human intelligence than they did in foot soldiers. Their counterintelligence capabilities were legendary, rivaling those of a national government. They systematically bribed employees of the Colombian phone company, allowing them to tap nearly every phone call in and out of Cali. They had police officers, military commanders, politicians, and journalists on their payroll. Their spies were everywhere. A lawyer considering taking on a case against them might receive a polite phone call in which the caller detailed the route his children took to school that morning. No explicit threat was needed. The message was understood. This created a blanket of silence and complicity that made them seem untouchable. They operated not above the law, like Escobar, but from within it, twisting its arms until it served their purposes. Their logistical innovations were just as sophisticated. While Medellin still relied on stuffing suitcases or using small planes, Cali thought on an industrial scale. They understood that the best way to hide a tree is in a forest. Cocaine was dissolved in chemicals and mixed with legitimate shipments. It was hidden inside hollowed-out lumber, mixed into shipments of coffee beans, or secreted within concrete fence posts that were shipped by the container load to construction companies they owned in the United States. Unpacking these shipments required industrial saws and chemical processes, far beyond the capabilities of a standard customs inspection. One of their most ingenious methods involved shipping thousands of boxes of frozen broccoli to Miami. Hidden among the legitimate produce were boxes where the broccoli had been replaced with meticulously crafted, green-tinted facsimiles made of pure cocaine. To a curious agent, it was just another pallet of frozen vegetables in a refrigerated warehouse filled with thousands just like it. They professionalized money laundering to an art form. Their financial network spanned the globe, using a complex web of shell corporations, offshore banks in Panama and the Caribbean, and legitimate businesses to wash their profits until they were indistinguishable from clean money. They hired the best lawyers and accountants to navigate and exploit international financial regulations. At their zenith in the early 1920s, after Escobar's death, the Cali cartel was estimated by the DEA to be responsible for 80% of the world's cocaine supply. They were a quiet, efficient, vertically integrated monopoly, a shadow government whose influence stretched from the coca fields of the Andes to the highest corridors of power in Bogota, and whose product was being delivered with corporate precision to a market that was clamouring for it. And where was all of this meticulously packaged, industrially shipped, and expertly laundered powder going? It was flowing north, in a vast white river, to a nation that was ready to receive it with open arms and open wallets. America in the late 1970s and 1980s was a country in the midst of a profound cultural shift. The hangover of Vietnam and the cynicism of Watergate were giving way to a new, unapologetic era of ambition, consumerism, and self-gratification. It was the age of Reagan, of greed is good, of Wall Street titans and Hollywood blockbusters. It was an era that worshipped speed, success, and status, and cocaine, as if designed in a laboratory for this very moment, became its perfect fuel. Unlike the drugs of the 60s counterculture, marijuana and LSD, which were associated with dropping out and expanding consciousness, cocaine was the drug of the aspirational. It was for winners. It didn't make you mellow, it made you sharp. It didn't make you contemplative, it made you confident. It promised to make you wittier, more energetic, more creative, more powerful. It was the ultimate accessory for the yuppie, the young urban professional climbing the corporate ladder. It was a line of pure white confidence, chopped and snorted in the bathroom stall before a major presentation, a dab on the gums before a high-stakes negotiation. On the frantic trading floors of Wall Street, it was the engine that allowed brokers to endure 20-hour days, to scream into phones, to process dizzying amounts of information, and to celebrate massive profits with an equally massive binge. In the exclusive back rooms of Hollywood studios, multi-million-dollar deals were sealed over glass tabletops dusted with white powder. It was the muse for screenwriters, the rocket fuel for rock stars, the secret indulgence of actors and actresses whose perfect smiles graced the covers of magazines. The drug shed its back-alley stigma and stepped into the Klieg lights. Nowhere was this transformation more apparent than at Studio 54, the legendary New York nightclub that served as the epicenter of 1970s disco-era hedonism. Behind its velvet ropes, a curated world of a celebrity, fashion, art and finance collided in a nightly spectacle of excess. And at the centre of it all was cocaine. It was passed around on silver trays like hors d'oeuvres. The club's famous logo, a man in the moon with a silver spoon to his nose, was a brazen, winking acknowledgement of the club's drug of choice. Here, cocaine wasn't a dirty secret. It was the social lubricant that fueled the entire glittering machine. It was a symbol of being part of the in-crowd, of having arrived. The paraphernalia itself became a status symbol. Gold razor blades for chopping perfect lines, ornate silver spoons for discreet bumps, polished mirrors and marble slabs as serving platters. The rituals of consumption were fetishized, a performance of sophisticated indulgence. Popular culture reflected and amplified this glamour. Films like Scarface, while a cautionary tale, also presented a mesmerizing portrait of narco wealth and power. Songs on the radio subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, referenced the white horse or the snow that powered the nightlife. It was everywhere, For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, cocaine was more than a drug. It was a cultural phenomenon, a shorthand for success, a sacrament of the new religion, ambition. This insatiable demand created a feedback loop of astonishing power. The more cocaine America consumed, the more money flowed south. And the more money flowed south, the more powerful and sophisticated the Colombian cartels became. The gentlemen of Cali watched this explosion in demand, not with the wild eyes of street dealers, but with the cool calculation of market analysts. They ramped up production, refined their logistics, and streamlined their delivery systems to meet the needs of their best and most profitable customer. The United States was a market of unprecedented scale, and they were the sole suppliers of its most fashionable commodity. The profits were beyond comprehension, enough to buy armies, topple governments, and reshape entire economies. But the glamour was built on a chemical, and that chemical was about to be re-engineered. A luxury good by its very nature excludes, and the laws of the market, like the laws of chemistry, are relentless. Someone, somewhere, was bound to find a way to make the champagne of drugs affordable for everyone. They did, and in doing so they unleashed a storm that would tear through the very fabric of American society. The chemistry was brutally simple. It didn't require a sophisticated lab or a trained chemist. It could be done in a kitchen pot with common household ingredients. By taking cocaine hydrochloride, the expensive powder form, and mixing it with a simple base like baking soda and a little water, then heating it, one could free the cocaine from its hydrochloride salt. As the mixture cooled, the psychoactive cocaine base would precipitate out, hardening into small crystalline pellets or rocks. The process made a distinct crackling sound as the water boiled off, and so the new substance got its name, crack. This simple chemical transformation changed everything. First, it changed the route of administration. Unlike powder, which was snorted, crack was stoked. Inhaling the vaporized cocaine delivered the drug to the brain through the vast surface area of the lungs in a matter of seconds. The result was a euphoric rush that was exponentially more intense and immediate than anything snorting could provide. It was a full-body explosion of pleasure, a tidal wave of dopamine that users described as the most profound high they had ever experienced. But this incredible peak was tragically fleeting. The intense euphoria lasted for perhaps 5 to 10 minutes, and was immediately followed by an equally intense crash, a plunge into dysphoria, anxiety, and a desperate, all-consuming craving to experience that high again. This rapid cycle of extreme high and crushing low created an addiction of unprecedented speed and ferocity. People who had only dabbled with powdered cocaine found themselves hopelessly hooked on crack after just a few uses. The second and perhaps most significant change was economic. In the mid-1980s, a gram of powdered cocaine might sell on the street for $100. For many people, especially in impoverished communities, this was a prohibitive price, a luxury they could never afford. Crack cocaine shattered that economic barrier. That same gram of powder could be cooked into numerous rocks, and a single rock could be sold for as little as $2, $3, or $5. This was the key. It was a stroke of perverse marketing genius. The drug was now democratized, its price point accessible to virtually anyone. It opened up a vast untapped market in America's inner cities, communities already hollowed out by decades of deindustrialization, white flight, and systemic neglect. The storm hit these neighborhoods with the force of a hurricane. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Washington, D.C., the arrival of cheap, smokable cocaine created a new and terrifying economy. Street corners that had been home to local businesses or kids playing stickball were transformed overnight into open-air drug markets, operating 24 hours a day. A new generation of young, heavily armed street gangs emerged, fighting brutal turf wars for control of this incredibly lucrative trade. The level of violence escalated dramatically. The quiet transaction in a nightclub bathroom was replaced by the shootout on a residential street. The social fabric of these communities began to unravel. The crack house, an abandoned or commandeered apartment where users could buy and smoke the drug, became a symbol of the decay, a place where all social norms collapsed. Families were torn apart as addiction took hold. Parents sold their possessions, and then themselves, to chase the next 5-minute high, leaving their children neglected. A generation of children were born to addicted mothers, and the media, in a frenzy of moral panic, coined the term crack babies, painting a terrifying and often exaggerated picture of a permanently damaged generation of neurologically impaired infants. While the long-term medical science proved to be more complex and less uniformly catastrophic than these early reports suggested, the immediate social reality for these children, born into chaos, poverty and trauma, was undeniably devastating. The response from the media and the government was not one of public health concern, but of war. Nightly news broadcasts were filled with sensationalized, lurid stories of crack-fueled violence and urban decay. The image presented was often racialized. The drug user was no longer the glamorous Wall Street broker or Hollywood star, but a young, menacing black man. This relentless media narrative stoked a nationwide panic, and politicians, eager to appear tough on crime, rushed to enact draconian laws. The most consequential of these was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This piece of legislation, passed in a flurry of pre-election hysteria, enshrined a staggering disparity in sentencing into federal law. It mandated that the possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine would trigger the same 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence as the possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. This was the infamous 100-to-1 sentencing ratio. The logic, if one could call it that, was that crack was more addictive and associated with more violence, and thus deserved a harsher penalty. The practical consequences of this law were catastrophic and profoundly discriminatory. The typical user of expensive powder cocaine was more likely to be white and middle class, and was rarely arrested for simple possession. The typical user and low-level seller of cheap crack cocaine was far more likely to be poor and African American, and was targeted by aggressive street-level policing. The result was the mass incarceration of a generation of young black men. Prison populations in the United States exploded. Families were destroyed not only by addiction but by a punitive justice system that sent fathers, sons and brothers away for years, sometimes decades, for nonviolent drug offences. The law did little to stem the flow of drugs, but it succeeded in decimating already vulnerable communities, deepening cycles of poverty and creating a profound and lasting sense of injustice. So the story of cocaine in America became a tale of 2 profoundly different worlds, dictated by chemistry and class. In the penthouses of Manhattan, it remained a discreet, if risky, indulgence, the powder that fueled ambition and excess. But in the housing projects of the South Bronx, its cheaper, smokable form became a symbol of societal collapse, a catalyst for a war on drugs that was, in practice, a war on the poor. 2 sides of the same white coin, one celebrated as the fuel of the elite, the other demonized as the poison of the underclass. It was the ultimate tragic expression of a powder that had, for a century, deceived the world with its promise of power, only to deliver ruin in its wake. The gentlemen in Cali, reading their spreadsheets and financial reports, likely paid little attention to the specific form their product took once it reached the American consumer. To them, it was all just a matter of market share, of meeting demand, of numbers on a page. But the numbers on the street told a very different story, a story of chemistry, economics, and a deep, unfolding American tragedy. And so, in the grand theatre of public policy, the curtain rose on a new and fearsome act. The shimmering white powder, once the darling of intellectuals and the fuel of high society, had found a new, more volatile form. Cooked down with baking soda and water, it became something hard, something cheap, something that could be smoked. It was called crack, and it burned through the inner cities of America like a phantom fire, leaving social devastation in its wake. The media, never one to miss a good panic, fanned the flames with nightly images of so-called crack babies and chaotic urban landscapes. The public demanded action. And in Washington, a city that runs on the twin fuels of fear and opportunity, action was swiftly delivered. The enemy was no longer a personal vice or a social ill. It was now an existential threat, and it required a declaration of war. This wasn't the first time the phrase had been used, of course. Richard Nixon had coined it years earlier. But the war he declared was a bureaucratic affair of treatment centres and commissions. The war of the 1980s, supercharged by the crack epidemic, was different. It was a literal war, with battlefield soldiers and a body count. It began, as many such ventures do, with a piece of paper, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a document born of moral certainty and electoral calculation. It was a masterpiece of legislative fury. At its heart was the concept of the mandatory minimum sentence. The nuanced art of judicial discretion was swept aside in favour of a rigid, brutal arithmetic. Possess 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of 2 sugar packets, and you were guaranteed a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. To receive the same sentence for powder cocaine, the drug of choice for the wealthier, whiter suburbs, you would need to be caught with 500 grams, a 100-to-1 disparity written into law. The logic was simple and devastatingly flawed. Crack was seen as more addictive, more violent, more urban. The law didn't just target a drug, it targeted a demographic. The gears of the state began to turn, grinding with a new and terrifying force. The lines blurred between policing and military operations. Surplus military hardware, once destined for battlefields in foreign lands, began to trickle, then flow, into the arsenals of local police departments. Armoured personnel carriers, M16 rifles, flashbang grenades. The friendly neighbourhood cop was replaced by a new figure, a warrior clad in black Kevlar and a ballistic helmet armed for a small-scale invasion. The primary tactic of the new war was the no-knock raid. In the dead of night, doors would splinter, families would be thrown to the floor, and homes would be ransacked in search of that crystalline rock or white powder. The war was fought not in trenches, but in living rooms and bedrooms across the country, and like any proper war, it had a foreign theatre. The logic was simple supply-side economics, filtered through the lens of a military strategist. If the demand at home was insatiable, then the only solution was to choke off the supply at its source. All eyes turned south, to the verdant valleys of the Andes and the steamy jungles of the Amazon basin, where the humble coca leaf was grown. The United States, through the Drug Enforcement Administration and the CIA, began to pour billions of dollars into Latin America. The policy had a clean, almost agricultural name, eradication, but its execution was anything but clean. Low-flying planes, often piloted by American contractors, would sweep over the Colombian and Peruvian countryside, spraying a fine mist of glyphosate herbicide. The chemical cocktail known as Roundup was designed to kill the coca plants. It did its job, but it did not discriminate. It killed yucca, coffee, and banana crops too. It poisoned watersheds and sickened livestock. It drove subsistence farmers who grew coca simply because it was the only crop that guaranteed a living, deeper into poverty and into the arms of the very traffickers the program was meant to undermine. The US also armed and trained local militaries, turning national armies into drug-fighting proxies. They built radar stations, supplied Black Hawk helicopters, and shared intelligence to hunt down the so-called kingpins. The primary weapon of this foreign policy was extradition. The threat of being flown north in chains to face trial in an American courtroom, far from the judges you could bribe and the witnesses you could intimidate, was the one thing the cartel leaders truly feared. Pablo Escobar, the king of Medellin, famously said he would rather have a tomb in Colombia than a jail cell in the United States. He fought a bloody, terroristic war against his own government to prevent it, bombing airplanes and assassinating presidential candidates. He and his rivals in the Cali cartel were the primary targets. They were the faces of the enemy, plastered on television screens, their immense wealth and casual brutality the perfect villains for this global drama. And slowly, painstakingly, the strategy seemed to work. Through a combination of relentless pursuit, internal betrayals and bloody shootouts, the great Colombian cartels of the late 20th century were dismantled. Escobar was gunned down on a rooftop in Medellin in 1993. The leaders of the Cali cartel were arrested or surrendered a few years later. From the Situation Room in the White House to the DEA field offices in Bogota, there was a palpable sense of victory. The heads of the serpent had been severed, but no one seemed to ask what would happen to the serpent's body. No one seemed to notice that while they had been fighting one war, they had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for another, more formidable monster to rise from the dust. The old system had a certain brutal clarity. The Colombians, the cartels of Medellin and Cali, were the producers and the wholesalers. They controlled the entire process, from the coca paste labs in the jungle to the multi-ton shipments flown or sailed northward. But they had an Achilles' heel, the final, most dangerous leg of the journey, the 954 miles of the US-Mexico border. It was a porous, treacherous landscape of desert scrub and shallow rivers, a place they did not know and did not control. For this final delivery they needed specialists, they needed subcontractors, and so they turned to the organisations that had been running contraband across that border for generations, small-time smuggling families from Sinaloa, Chihuahua and Baja California, who knew the routes, the rhythms of the Border Patrol and the corruptible nature of officials on both sides. Initially, the arrangement was simple. The Mexicans were paid a flat fee for their services, a few $1,000s in cash for every kilogram of cocaine they successfully moved into the United States. They were the couriers, the truck drivers, the mules. They were logistics men, nothing more. The man who first saw the true potential in this arrangement was a former judicial police officer from Sinaloa named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. He was known as El Padrino, the Godfather. He was not a flamboyant killer like Escobar. He was a businessman, a visionary. He saw that the real power lay not in producing the drug, but in controlling its path to market. He unified the disparate smuggling clans into a single cohesive federation, the Guadalajara cartel. He controlled the plazas, the lucrative smuggling corridors that were the gateways into the American dream. For a time, the system worked beautifully for everyone. The Colombians had a reliable delivery network, and Felix Gallardo's organization grew wealthy on transport fees. But then, the pressure of the war on drugs began to change the equation. As the US and Colombian governments relentlessly hunted Escobar and the Cali Rodriguez brothers, their operations became fractured. Their cash flow was disrupted. They became desperate, and in their desperation they gave Felix Gallardo and his associates an opening. The Mexicans began to change the terms of the deal. They no longer wanted cash. Cash was bulky, difficult to launder. They wanted something far more valuable. They wanted a piece of the product. Instead of a fee, they began to demand payment in kind. They would take 35, then 40, then eventually 50% of every cocaine shipment they transported. It was a strategic masterstroke, a quiet revolution in the underworld. With that single shift, the Mexican organizations were transformed. They were no longer just the delivery boys. They were now wholesalers with their own inventory, their own product to sell, and direct access to the largest consumer market on Earth. They began to build their own distribution networks in American cities, cutting out the Colombian middlemen entirely. The fall of the great Colombian cartels, celebrated as a monumental victory in Washington, created a power vacuum of epic proportions, and into that vacuum stepped the newly empowered Mexican federations. The arrest of Felix Gallardo in 1989, a consequence of the political firestorm following the torture and the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, did not stop the machine he had built. It only caused it to break apart into its constituent components, each one now a powerful entity in its own right. The old Guadalajara cartel fractured into the cartels we know today. In the northwest, the ambitious and violent Arellano Felix brothers seized control of the Tijuana Plaza, the lucrative gateway to California. In the center, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, nicknamed the Lord of the Skies for his fleet of Boeing 727s, used to fly cocaine directly from Colombia, took over the Juarez Plaza. And in the mountains of Sinaloa, a farmer's son of short stature but limitless ambition, Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, began to consolidate power with his partners, forming what would become the Sinaloa cartel. The dynamic had been irrevocably altered. The Colombians, once the undisputed kings, were now reduced to mere suppliers, forced to sell their product to the Mexicans at the source. The Mexicans now controlled the entire logistical chain north of Colombia. They controlled the routes, the prices and the profits. They were no longer subcontractors, they were the board of directors. A new narco-eparchy had been established, with its Vatican in Culiacan, and its dioceses in Tijuana, Juarez and Matamoros. They were wealthier, more sophisticated, and more deeply entrenched than their Colombian predecessors had ever been. The war to kill the kingpins of Medellin and Cali had not ended the monarchy. It had simply cleared the way for a new, more powerful dynasty to take the throne. The United States had spent a decade and billions of dollars slaying one dragon, only to find it had created a hydra, and this new beast was growing on its very doorstep. The vast river of money flowing north was now matched by an equally vast river of money flowing south. Tens of billions of dollars a year, a cash flow greater than the gross domestic product of many small nations, pouring back into Mexico. This unprecedented wealth allowed the cartels to undergo a final terrifying metamorphosis. They began to evolve beyond the scope of a traditional criminal organization. They were no longer just traffickers. They were becoming something else entirely, a parallel state, a narco-state existing within and alongside the official Mexican government, sometimes cooperating with it, sometimes fighting it, but always challenging its sovereignty. This evolution began with corruption, an age-old practice perfected to an industrial scale. The choice offered to officials, from the local cop on the beat to the federal prosecutor, from the small-town mayor to the cabinet minister, was brutally simple. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, a briefcase full of cash or a coffin full of you. Most chose the silver. Police departments became private security forces for the cartels. Military commanders would leak intelligence on troop movements. Politicians would pass laws favourable to their patrons. The corruption became so systemic that it was no longer an aberration, it was the operating system. The state was not just infiltrated, it was co-opted, its institutions hollowed out and repurposed to serve the interests of the traffic. But the narco-state is built on more than just bribery. It provides services. In many rural parts of Mexico, forgotten by the central government, the local cartel became the de facto authority. If a farmer had a dispute with his neighbour, he didn't go to the police, he went to the local jefe. The cartel paved roads, built churches, sponsored festivals, and handed out cash to the poor. They provided employment in a country with few opportunities. They offered a form of swift, if barbaric, justice. They became the government, the bank, and the social safety net all rolled into one. They were buying not just silence, but loyalty, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the communities they controlled. This social control was the soft power that complemented their hard power, and that hard power became truly formidable. The cartels began to arm themselves not like gangsters, but like armies. They established training camps in remote mountains and jungles, often run by former Special Forces soldiers from Mexico, Guatemala, and even the United States. A new organisation, Los Zetas, exemplified this shift. They were not traditional smugglers who had turned violent. They were violence professionals who had gone into smuggling. Originally formed as an elite enforcement wing for the Gulf Cartel from a corps of deserters from the Mexican Army's Airborne Special Forces Group, the Zetas brought a new level of military discipline and technological sophistication to the underworld. They were the first to use military tactics, to coordinate attacks using encrypted communications, and to fully embrace terrorism as a tool of control. Their arsenals were staggering. They acquired .50 caliber sniper rifles capable of disabling engine blocks, rocket-propelled grenades, automatic grenade launchers, and even anti-aircraft weapons. They built their own armoured fighting vehicles known as monsters, by welding thick steel plates onto heavy-duty trucks, creating crude but effective personnel carriers. They engaged the Mexican military in pitched battles that lasted for hours, sometimes days. They shot down helicopters. They blockaded entire cities. The traditional lines of conflict became hopelessly blurred. This was no longer a matter of crime fighting. It was a low-intensity civil war, fought block by block in cities like Juarez, Tijuana, and Culiacan. The most chilling demonstration of this power came in October of 2020. The Mexican military, with US intelligence support, launched an operation in Culiacan, the heart of the Sinaloa cartel's territory, to capture Ovidio Guzman, one of El Chapo's sons. They succeeded briefly. Within minutes, the city erupted. Hundreds of cartel gunmen, heavily armed and impeccably coordinated, poured into the streets. They set up burning blockades, attacked military bases, seized control of the city's airport, and took soldiers' families hostage. The city was paralysed, under siege from within. The fighting was broadcast live on social media, a spectacle of state failure. The Mexican security forces were outmanoeuvred, outgunned, and overwhelmed. After hours of intense combat, the order came directly from the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. To avoid further bloodshed, he commanded the army to stand down and release Ovidio Guzman. The cartel had won. They had faced the full power of the Mexican state in open battle and forced it to retreat. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the government and a terrifying clarification for the world. It demonstrated that in certain parts of Mexico, the state's monopoly on violence, the very definition of a sovereign nation, no longer existed. The narco-state was no longer a shadow government. In the streets of Culiacan for one bloody afternoon, it was the only government there was. The powder had done more than corrupt a few officials. It had funded an insurgency that now held a nation hostage, a quiet, creeping conquest financed 1 gram at a time. The American market, for all its voraciousness, was finite. By the late 1980s and into the 90s, the cities of the United States were swimming in cocaine. Prices had stabilized, competition was murderous, and law enforcement, however clumsy, was beginning to exert a more consistent pressure. The Colombian cartels, ever the forward-thinking global enterprises, understood a fundamental principle of business: market diversification. They needed a new frontier, a new continent of wallets to open and nostrils to fill, and so their gaze turned eastward, across the vast and lonely expanse of the Atlantic, to the Old World. Europe, with its wealthy cities, its established trade routes, and its own quiet appetites, was the next logical prize. This was the opening of the Second Front, a European corridor that would reshape the global flow of the powder and entangle a whole new cast of characters in its story. Initially, the methods were almost quaintly direct. A courier on a commercial flight from Bogota to Madrid, luggage lined with a few carefully pressed kilos, a small shipment hidden within a container of coffee beans or bananas, destined for the ports of Lisbon or Naples. These were feelers, probes into a new market, testing the defences and mapping the demand. But the Colombians learned quickly that Europe was not America. The borders were different, the languages more numerous, the law enforcement agencies a fractured patchwork of jurisdictions. They could not simply replicate the Miami model. They needed partners. They needed local expertise, and so they went into business with the most experienced and formidable organised crime syndicate in Europe, an organisation that made the Sicilians of Cosa Nostra look almost flamboyant and reckless by comparison. They were the men from Calabria, the mountainous toe of Italy's boot. They were the 'Ndrangheta. For decades, the 'Ndrangheta had operated in the shadows, a sprawling clan-based hydra with tentacles reaching from their provincial homelands to the financial centres of the north and across the globe. They were masters of logistics, particularly maritime logistics. They controlled through a combination of corruption, intimidation, and legitimate business fronts the colossal container port of Gioia Tauro. It was a perfect gateway. A container ship arriving from South America could offload tens of thousands of containers. Finding one specific box filled with cocaine hidden among frozen chickens or industrial machinery was a task of impossible scale for customs officials, especially when port employees and transport union officials were on the 'Ndrangheta payroll. The partnership was a model of criminal efficiency. The Colombians would handle production and transatlantic shipping. The 'Ndrangheta would guarantee safe passage into Europe through ports like Gioia Tauro, Rotterdam or Antwerp, and then leverage their extensive, deeply embedded networks to distribute the product across the continent. It was a quieter, more corporate arrangement than the bloody street wars of Medellin. It was about shared risk and astronomical profit. The 'Ndrangheta proved to be impeccably reliable partners. They paid on time, they didn't ask too many questions, and they moved tonnage with a professionalism that the Colombians deeply respected. Soon hundreds of kilos became tons. The European cocaine market exploded. From the banking halls of London and Zurich to the nightclubs of Ibiza and Berlin, the white powder became the ubiquitous fuel for the continent's fast lane. But as the volume increased, the direct routes became riskier. European authorities, waking up to the scale of the problem, began to coordinate. Maritime patrols intensified. Port security was tightened. The traffickers, as they always do, adapted. They looked at a map and saw a solution, a geographic stepping stone that was both a shield and a shortcut. They saw West Africa. The coastline, stretching from Senegal down to Nigeria, became the world's great transit lounge for cocaine. It was a smuggler's paradise, a region of breathtaking beauty scarred by poverty, political instability, and porous borders. Countries like Guinea-Bissau, a tiny nation crippled by coups and corruption, became, for all intents and purposes, the first true narco-states outside of Latin America. The traffickers' logic was simple and brutal. A large mothership, a freighter or a fishing trawler, would sail from the coasts of Colombia or Venezuela. It would meet smaller, faster boats far out in international waters, off the coast of Cape Verde or Guinea. The cocaine, sealed in waterproof bales, would be transferred. These smaller boats would then dart to shore, landing on remote beaches or travelling up forgotten rivers, met by local crews. Once on African soil, the powder was safe. It could be stored in warehouses in Bissau or Conakry, guarded by bribed officials or private militias. The region already had sophisticated, long-established smuggling networks, honed by decades of moving everything from diamonds to cigarettes to people. Cocaine was just another commodity. From West Africa, the routes into Europe were numerous. The product could be repackaged and flown on commercial flights by armies of couriers. It could be hidden in cargo planes carrying fish or fruit to Paris and Brussels. Most audaciously, it could be flown directly into the heart of Europe on private jets, ghost flights, that filed false flight plans and landed at small, poorly monitored airfields in Spain or Portugal. The sheer ingenuity was something to behold. They used semi-submersible vessels, low-profile drone submarines that could carry several tons of cocaine, gliding silently beneath the waves, almost impossible to detect by radar or sonar. The European corridor was no longer a single path. It was a complex, multi-layered web, a circulatory system pumping a white poison into the continent's bloodstream. And the Ndrangheta were not the only players for long. The vacuum of the collapsed Soviet Union and the chaos of the Yugoslav wars had forged a new generation of ruthlessly efficient criminal organizations. Balkan syndicates, particularly Serbian and Albanian groups, established themselves as major players. They were disciplined, multilingual, and extremely violent. They specialized in the overland logistics, moving cocaine from the southern ports of entry northward in trucks, through the seamless, borderless expanse of the Schengen zone. They controlled the street-level distribution in cities across Germany, Scandinavia, and the United Kingdom. In the port cities of Antwerp and Rotterdam, the logistical hearts of Europe, the so-called Mokro Mafia, composed largely of Dutch-Moroccan criminals, battled for control of the docks, their feuds playing out in a string of shocking public assassinations. Europe's old-world calm was shattered. The continent had its own cocaine war now, less visible than Colombia's perhaps, but just as corrosive, turning port cities into battlegrounds and quiet villages in Africa into hubs of global crime. The powder, ever adaptable, had found its new home. And then, as the 21st century wore on, the nature of the powder itself began to change. The story takes another dark turn, not in the jungles of the Andes or the boardrooms of the cartels, but in clandestine laboratories far away, and in the very chemistry of the drugs themselves. A new spectre had emerged, a synthetic ghost that would attach itself to the cocaine trade with devastating consequences. Its name was fentanyl. It began subtly, as a whisper in coroners' reports and toxicology screens in the mid-2010s, a cocaine overdose but with anomalous findings. The victim hadn't just stopped breathing from cardiac arrest, the classic cocaine-induced outcome. They had simply faded out. Respiratory depression, the telltale sign of an opioid. At first, it was thought to be a case of the user mixing drugs, a speedball of cocaine and heroin. But then the cases multiplied, and the victims were often people with no history of opioid use. They were weekend warriors, partygoers, people who thought that they were buying a gram of cocaine for a night out. They had no idea they were ingesting one of the most potent opioids ever synthesized by man. Fentanyl is a creature of the laboratory, a pure synthetic first created in '59 as a powerful anesthetic for surgery. It is 50 times more potent than heroin, 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose the size of 2 grains of salt can be lethal to a person with no opioid tolerance. For the modern drug syndicate, particularly the Mexican cartels who had now largely eclipsed the Colombians as the dominant force in the North American market, fentanyl was a business miracle. Its precursor chemicals could be sourced cheaply from China. It could be manufactured in a simple lab, with no need for vast agricultural plantations, no coca farmers to manage, no seasonal harvests. And its potency was its greatest economic advantage. A single kilogram of pure fentanyl, costing a few $1,000s to produce, could be cut and stretched to create hundreds of thousands of individual doses for the street. The contamination of the cocaine supply was born of this cold market logic. Sometimes it was accidental. A dealer using the same scale or mixing surface for both fentanyl-laced heroin and cocaine. A tiny, invisible residue was all it took. But increasingly it became deliberate. Cutting cocaine with a cheap, powerful and intensely addictive synthetic opioid was a monstrously effective business strategy. It stretched the expensive cocaine, increasing profit margins, and for those who survived it could create a new, powerful dependency, hooking a user on opioids without them even knowing it. The euphoric rush of cocaine would be followed by the heavy narcotic pull of fentanyl, a confusing and often terrifying combination. The user would then crave that specific feeling again, seeking out the same dealer, their brain chemistry now rewired by a substance they never intended to take. The public health consequences were catastrophic. The cocaine user base is fundamentally different from the heroin user base. Many are recreational users who associate their drug of choice with energy, confidence, and late nights. They have no concept of opioid overdose, no Narcan on hand, and no understanding of the risk of respiratory arrest. The party drug had become a game of Russian roulette. A single line, a single bump at a bar or a concert could now be a death sentence. The third wave of the opioid crisis had officially begun, and it was a wave that washed over everyone. Overdose deaths in the United States, which had already been climbing due to prescription pills and heroin, skyrocketed into unheard-of territory. Over 100,000 Americans were dying a year, a number once unimaginable, and a significant and growing percentage of those deaths involved cocaine contaminated with fentanyl. This new reality changed everything. It transformed the risk calculus for millions of people. It turned every street-level dealer into a potential angel of death, whether they knew it or not. The cartels in Mexico, primarily the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, were now the primary manufacturers of this poison, pressing it into counterfeit prescription pills and mixing it into heroin, methamphetamine, and, of course, cocaine. They flooded the United States with it, using the same sophisticated smuggling corridors they had perfected over decades. The powder that had once been seen as a symbol of glamour and success, the drug of Wall Street traders and Hollywood stars, was now inextricably linked to a synthetic killer that was decimating communities with the ruthless efficiency of a plague. The great deception of cocaine had entered its most lethal phase. The promise of a thrilling high was now shadowed by the immediate, random, and silent possibility of death. The user, seeking a moment of escape or exhilaration, was gambling with their life, unaware that the deck had been stacked against them in a laboratory thousands of miles away. The white powder was no longer just a drug. It was a potential poison delivery system, a Trojan horse carrying the deadliest synthetic opioid in history. And so we arrive at the end of our long, dark road, and we are left to survey the wreckage. A century of ambition, greed, violence, and despair, all swirling around a simple alkaloid extracted from a mountain leaf. The legacy of cocaine is not written in history books, not really. It is etched onto the surface of the earth, carved into the fabric of societies, and buried in millions of graves. It is a legacy of blood and powder. First, look to the land. The Amazon basin, the lungs of our planet, bears deep and permanent scars. For every hectare of land used to cultivate coca, several more are destroyed. The process begins with slash-and-burn agriculture, ancient forests cleared with fire and machete to make way for the illicit crop. These plantations exhaust the fragile soil in just a few years, forcing the growers to move on, cutting ever deeper into the rainforest, leaving a patchwork of devastation behind them. But the destruction does not end with the clearing of the trees. The process of turning coca leaves into cocaine paste, the first step towards the final white powder, is a form of chemical warfare on the environment. This is not clean chemistry. It happens in crude, hidden labs in the jungle, using a toxic slurry of chemicals. Rivers of gasoline or kerosene are used to strip the alkaloid from the leaf. Vats of sulfuric acid, caustic soda, and potassium permanganate are employed in the refinement. And when the process is finished, where do these poisons go? They are simply dumped, poured directly onto the forest floor where they sterilize the soil, or into the nearest stream which carries them into the great river systems of the Amazon and the Orinoco. They kill the fish, poison the water that remote communities drink, and create vast dead zones in what was once the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth. For every gram of cocaine consumed in a nightclub in a distant city, a corresponding measure of poison has been emptied into the heart of the world. It is a quiet, ongoing ecological disaster, the hidden environmental cost of a global habit. Then there is the legacy of corruption, the hollowing out of nations. Cocaine money is a universal acid. It dissolves institutions, melts loyalties, and corrodes the very idea of a civil society. In countries like Colombia in the 1980s and 90s, and Mexico in the 2000s and beyond, the cartels achieved a level of power that rivaled the state. They did not just bribe officials, they became a parallel government. They offered two simple choices to police chiefs, to judges, to mayors, to presidential candidates. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, a briefcase full of cash or a coffin. Many chose the silver, and entire government departments, police forces and judiciaries became subsidiaries of the narco enterprise. Those who chose lead, the brave ones, the honest ones, paid with their lives, their assassination serving as a brutal lesson to any who would dare to stand in the way. This creates a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The state, weakened by the corruption and fear, cannot provide security or justice for its citizens. So as people turn to the local narco boss, who dispenses his own brutal form of order, building schools and churches with drug money while murdering his rivals in the town square. The line between government and organised crime blurs until it disappears entirely. A narco state is born. This is not just a Latin American phenomenon. We have seen its shadow fall over West Africa, where drug money has funded coups and propped up kleptocratic regimes. The powder corrupts everything it touches, creating a world of ghosts, ghost politicians, ghost police, ghost economies, all animated by the ceaseless flow of illicit cash. And finally there is the human cost, a cost so staggering it defies easy comprehension. It is a pyramid of suffering. At the very bottom is the cocalero, the coca farmer. He's not a kingpin, he's usually a poor peasant, trapped by economics and geography, growing the only crop that guarantees a living wage, however meagre. He lives under the thumb of the traffickers on one side and the government eradication forces on the other. His life a constant negotiation with violence. Above him are the chemists in the jungle labs, breathing toxic fumes, their lives disposable. And then the mules, the desperate young men and women who swallow condoms filled with cocaine or strap it to their bodies, praying they won't be caught and praying the packages won't burst inside them, a gruesome and certain death. And there is the violence. The sicarios, the teenage hitmen, often recruited from the slums, for whom life is cheap and murder is a job. The endless wars between cartels for control of smuggling routes, which are not wars in any conventional sense. They are campaigns of extermination marked by torture, dismemberment and public displays of butchery designed to terrorize rivals and the civilian population alike. The hundreds of thousands dead in Mexico alone. The generations in Colombia who knew nothing but conflict, the communities in inner-city America decimated by the crack epidemic and the gang wars it fueled. The cost is counted in the bodies, but also in the traumatized survivors, the orphans, the displaced families, the millions whose lives have been irrevocably broken by this trade. And at the very top of the pyramid, the user. In a way, they are victims too, caught in the grip of a powerful addiction. But they are also the engine. The casual user at a dinner party, the addict in a dark alley, the banker celebrating a deal. Their demand is the signal that echoes all the way down the chain of supply, setting the entire infernal machine in motion. Their money is the fuel. Cocaine's ultimate trick, its greatest, most enduring deception, was to disguise this global pyramid of misery as a line of white powder on a mirror. It promised power, euphoria and glamour. But its true legacy is one of scarred landscapes, broken nations, and a body count that will never be fully known. A legacy of blood and powder endlessly renewed as long as the world keeps wanting more.